The piece of paper hanging on the wall of an office can tell you where a person came from, but it can never tell you where they are going. In the high-stakes, sterile world of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, degrees were treated like royal titles. If you carried a diploma from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, or Stanford, you walked the hallways like a king. The nurses bowed their heads, the residents scrambled to open doors, and the administration looked the other way no matter how cruel you were to the staff. At the very top of this medical hierarchy stood Dr. Julian Vance. He was a chief cardiothoracic surgeon whose hands were undeniably blessed, but whose heart was entirely frozen. Julian believed that a person's worth was directly tied to the prestige of their institution. To him, the world was divided into two kinds of people: the elite who earned the right to save lives, and the mediocre who were simply there to clean up the mess. Clara was a ghost in the hospital. She never complained, she never raised her voice, and she never participated in the cafeteria gossip. She wore oversized scrubs, kept her hair tied back in a strict, practical bun, and drove a battered 10-year-old sedan that rattled whenever it idled in the staff parking lot. But what bothered Dr. Vance the most wasn't her quiet demeanor. It was the tiny, faded frame sitting on her desk in the nurse's locker room. It was a degree from a small, completely unranked online community college nestled in the rural mountains of Montana. A school most people had never heard of, which offered accelerated associate degrees to adults looking for a midlife career change. The first time Julian saw it, he laughed out loud in front of the entire surgical team. He asked her if the diploma came with a free side of fries, or if she had to print it out herself on standard printer paper. Clara didn't flinch. She simply looked him in the eye, picked up her clipboard, and went back to checking her patient's vitals. That silence only fueled Julian's arrogance. He made it his personal mission to remind Clara, every single day, that her cheap education made her a liability in his pristine hospital. The abuse became a daily ritual during morning rounds. Julian would purposely bypass the head nurse and direct the most complex, jargon-heavy medical questions straight at Clara, hoping to catch her tripping over her words. He wanted to humiliate her in front of the young residents to show them what happens when you don't aim for the Ivy League. One rainy Tuesday morning, after a grueling 12-hour shift, Julian cornered her at the central nursing station. He dropped a massive, 500-page cardiac research journal onto the counter, right next to her coffee cup. He told her to read chapters 4 through 12 by the evening, sneering that he knew online colleges usually stuck to picture books, but he expected her to at least try to understand the vocabulary. The surrounding residents chuckled nervously, looking down at their shoes. Clara didn't look down. She looked directly at Julian's pristine, custom-tailored white coat, then at his immaculate hands. She calmly pushed the book aside and told him that she had already completed her rounds and that patient in room 412 was showing early signs of a pulmonary embolism, despite his post-operative charts looking completely normal. Julian's face flushed with anger. He felt insulted that a nurse with a third-rate degree was attempting to diagnose his patient. He loudly informed her that he had performed a flawless triple bypass on that patient, and his surgical work did not leave room for errors. He told her to stick to changing bed sheets and administering standard saline drips, leaving the real medicine to people who actually spend $250,000 on their education. He ordered her out of the pavilion and demanded she be reassigned to the general ward, far away from his high-profile patients. Clara quietly gathered her belongings, apologized to the staff for the disruption, and walked away without a single tear in her eyes. But less than 2 hours later, an alarm shattered the peace of the fourth floor. The patient in room 412 had suddenly collapsed. His oxygen levels were plummeting, and his chest was seizing. When Julian rushed into the room, his hands trembling as he grabbed the defibrillator paddles, he realized with a sinking heart that the patient was experiencing a massive pulmonary embolism, exactly as Clara had predicted. Instead of feeling grateful or humbled, Julian's embarrassment turned into a deep, vindictive resentment. He convinced himself that Clara had simply guessed correctly by pure luck. He couldn't accept the idea that her instincts were sharper than his advanced diagnostic training. The next week, a multi-car pileup on the nearby interstate flooded the emergency room with critical trauma patients. The hospital was understaffed, and Julian was forced to work alongside Clara in the trauma bay. A young man was brought in with a severe laceration to his femoral artery, spiraling into hemorrhagic shock. Blood was pooling rapidly on the concrete floor, and the standard pressure dressings were completely failing. Julian ordered a specific surgical clamp, but the instruments were misplaced in the chaos of the emergency room. As Julian began to panic, yelling at the residency students for their incompetence, Clara stepped forward. Without asking for permission, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a thick tactical combat tourniquet, wrapped it high and tight around the patient's upper thigh, and twisted the windlass until the torrential bleeding completely stopped in a matter of seconds. Julian stared at her, stunned by the sheer speed and unorthodox nature of the maneuver. It wasn't a technique taught in standard civilian nursing textbooks. It was aggressive, brutal, and highly effective. But his pride quickly overrode his amazement. He aggressively grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the trauma bed, and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. He yelled that this wasn't a battlefield, and her rogue, unsterilized internet school tactics could cause nerve damage to the patient. He told her she was completely reckless, and that he would personally ensure the board revoked her license for practicing medicine outside of her scope. Clara didn't pull her arm away. She simply looked down at his grip until he let go. She told him that the patient would have bled to death in the 90 seconds it took to find the correct clamp, and that a living patient with temporary nerve pain is always preferable to a perfectly sterile corpse. She then walked back to the bedside, calmly checking the patient's distal pulse, leaving Julian standing in the middle of the chaotic trauma bay, speechlessly gripping his surgical instruments. Determined to rid his sanctuary of this insubordinate nurse, Julian marched directly to the office of the Chief of Medicine, Dr. Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a seasoned administrator who usually catered to Julian's every whim because Julian brought in millions of dollars in donor funding to the hospital. Julian slammed his fist on the mahogany desk and demanded that Clara Avery be fired immediately. He cited insubordination, reckless medical practices, and an inadequate educational background that threatened the hospital's reputation. He expected Arthur to nod, apologize, and sign the termination paperwork right then and there. But instead, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Arthur looked at the paperwork, then looked up at Julian with an expression that wasn't compliance, but genuine, deep-seated fear. Arthur slowly took off his glasses, rubbed his temples, and told Julian that he needed to sit down and listen very carefully. He told Julian that under no— Julian laughed, assuming Arthur was playing some sort of political game with a wealthy hospital donor who might be related to Clara. He asked if Clara was the niece of a board member or if she was blackmailing someone in human resources. Arthur didn't laugh. He opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out Clara's employee file. He turned it around and pushed it across the desk toward Julian. When Julian opened it, his eyes widened in confusion. The file was completely empty except for 3 pages. And every single line on those pages, her employment history, her references, her background check, her medical certifications, was completely blacked out with heavy, thick permanent marker. The only thing visible at the top of the page was her name, Clara Avery, and at the bottom, a massive, official red ink stamp that read, Department of Defense, Level 5 Security Clearance, High Asset Protection. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He asked what kind of a joke this was, demanding to know how an online college graduate from Montana could possibly possess a top-secret government clearance. Arthur leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told Julian that when Clara applied to the hospital, her credentials didn't come through the standard online portal. They were hand-delivered to his office by 2 men in dark suits carrying federal identification badges. They told Arthur that Clara needed a quiet, low-profile placement in a civilian hospital where she could work the night shift without drawing attention to herself. They didn't explain why, and they didn't offer any details about her past. They simply told Arthur that if her employment was disrupted or if her true identity was compromised, the hospital would face immediate federal intervention. Arthur warned Julian to stay away from her, to stop his childish bullying, and to treat her like glass. But Julian's ego was too massive to accept the warning. He convinced himself that Clara was probably just a disgraced former government employee, or perhaps a witness in a federal protection program who had used her connections to forge a classified file. He refused to believe that a woman who took his insults without a fight could be anyone of actual importance. The tension between them reached a boiling point over the next 2 weeks. Julian went out of his way to make Clara's life miserable, assigning her the most physically demanding patient rotations, denying her vacation requests, and constantly making passive-aggressive remarks about how some people need Uncle Sam to protect their jobs because their medical degrees certainly couldn't do it. Clara continued to endure it all with an eerie, unbreakable calm. She never reported him to human resources, and she never spoke back. She simply watched him with a strange, analytical gaze, as if she were studying a specimen under a microscope rather than listening to an angry superior. One evening, a massive, unseasonal storm knocked out power grids across the state, plunging the city into darkness. The hospital's backup generators kicked in immediately, but the sudden surge caused a critical failure in the automated medication dispensing systems and the electronic patient tracking monitors. The hospital was thrown into absolute chaos, with staff running blind, trying to manage hundreds of critical patients without their digital safety nets. In the middle of this storm, a fleet of 4 unmarked, heavily armored black SUVs tore into the ambulance bay, bypassing the standard intake protocols entirely. They didn't turn on their sirens, but their high-intensity strobe lights cut through the torrential rain. Dozens of heavily armed men in tactical gear jumped out, instantly securing the perimeter of the emergency department. They pushed past the local security guards, locking down the entrances and blocking anyone from entering or leaving the surgical pavilion. The hospital staff panicked, thinking a terrorist attack or a massive federal raid was taking place. Julian, who was in the middle of preparing for a routine surgery, stormed down to the emergency room lobby, furious that his schedule was being disrupted by a security breach. He demanded to speak to whoever was in charge, shouting that he was the chief surgeon and that they were endangering his patients. Before Julian could finish his sentence, the heavy glass double doors of the ambulance bay slid open. A tall, imposing man walked into the hospital lobby. He was wearing an immaculate, dark green military dress uniform adorned with an overwhelming array of medals, ribbons, and 3 gleaming silver stars on each shoulder. It was a lieutenant general from the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, straight from the Pentagon. Behind him walked a team of elite military medics, pushing a specialized gurney carrying a patient wrapped in a thermal blanket, surrounded by portable life support equipment that Julian had only ever seen in advanced military medical journals. The general didn't look at the panic-stricken nurses, he didn't look at the trembling security guards, and he completely ignored Julian, who was standing right in front of him with his chest puffed out, ready to deliver a lecture on hospital protocol. The general stopped in the center of the lobby, his eyes scanning the crowd of terrified medical staff. In a loud, commanding voice that echoed off the sterile walls, he asked where the chief trauma director was. Julian stepped forward, adjusting his white coat, assuming the general was referring to him as the highest-ranking medical authority in the building. Julian confidently announced his name, his Ivy League credentials, and stated that he was the chief surgeon in charge of the pavilion. The general looked at Julian for a brief, cold second, his expression filled with absolute dismissiveness. He told Julian that he didn't care about his name, his surgeries, or his expensive degrees. He stated that his team was here on a matter of urgent national security, under direct orders from the Secretary of Defense, and they were not looking for a civilian heart surgeon. He looked past Julian's shoulder, his eyes locking onto a figure standing quietly at the back of the room near the water cooler. The general took a deep breath of relief, stepped around Julian as if he were a piece of common furniture, and marched straight toward Clara Avery. Julian turned around, his jaw dropping in absolute disbelief as he watched the 3-star general halt exactly 2 feet in front of the quiet, mock night shift nurse. The general brought his hand up to his brow and delivered a crisp, perfectly executed military salute. He addressed her not as Clara, and certainly not as an online school nurse. He called her Colonel Avery, Chief Director of the Pentagon's Advanced Combat Medicine and Surgical Intelligence Division. He told her that a Tier 1 operational asset had been critically wounded in a deniable operation overseas, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The local military hospitals were compromised, and they had tracking data showing that she was the only surgeon alive who had successfully performed the highly experimental vascular reconstruction technique required to save this man's life. He told her that the Pentagon needed her back, by rank and by name, effective immediately, and that the president had personally signed the executive activation order to restore her to active command. The entire lobby fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The residents who had laughed at Julian's jokes stood frozen. The nurses who had pitied Clara stared with wide eyes. Julian felt the blood drain completely from his face, his legs turning to lead as the reality of the situation crashed down upon his fragile ego. The woman he had spent 3 years treating like an uneducated peasant, the woman he had mocked for having a worthless online degree, was a highly decorated military colonel and one of the most vital medical assets in the entire United States defense infrastructure. Her quietness wasn't a sign of weakness or ignorance. It was the discipline of a soldier who had operated under mortar fire while Julian was sitting in comfortable university lecture halls. Her faded degree from the small Montana community college wasn't her only education. It was simply a cover story, a low-profile certification she picked up to legally work in a civilian facility without triggering flags in national databases while she was taking a mandated psychological sabbatical from the horrors of the front lines. Clara stood up straight, her entire posture shifting in an instant. The slouch was gone. The timid, unassuming nurse vanished, replaced by an aura of absolute command that made everyone in the room instinctively want to stand at attention. She didn't look surprised, and she didn't look afraid. She looked at the general, acknowledged the salute with a sharp nod, and stepped toward the gurney to assess the patient. She checked the vitals, analyzed the portable monitor readouts, and immediately began barking out orders in a calm, authoritative tone that brooked no argument. She commanded the military medics to prepare operating room 4, ordered the hospital pharmacy to release specific blood types and experimental clotting factors, and told the security team to lock down the entire surgical floor. The staff moved instantly, terrified and inspired by the sudden transformation of the woman they thought they knew. As Clara began to wheel the patient toward the trauma elevators, she paused. She turned her head and looked directly at Julian, who was still standing paralyzed in the center of the lobby, his hands trembling against his sides. For the first time in 3 years, Clara addressed him directly outside of standard patient updates. She told him that she needed an assistant who was exceptionally clean with a scalpel, even if his attitude was atrocious. She asked him if his expensive Ivy League degree had taught him how to handle a massive, active thoracic hemorrhage under high-stress conditions, or if he only knew how to perform surgeries when the lights were perfect and the power grids were stable. She told him to scrub in immediately or to get out of her way. Julian couldn't speak. He could only nod rapidly, his pride completely shattered, swallowed by a sudden, overwhelming wave of humility. Inside operating room 4, the atmosphere was unlike anything Julian had ever experienced. The room was packed with military medical personnel, communications techs syncing directly with the Pentagon, and armed guards at the doors. The patient's chest was open, and the situation was catastrophic. A rare, fragmented piece of shrapnel had lodged itself deep into the posterior wall of the aorta, causing a microscopic tear that was slowly, invisibly draining the patient's life force. Julian, despite his arrogance, was indeed a highly skilled surgeon, but as he looked into the surgical field, he realized he was completely out of his depth. The anatomical landmarks were distorted by scar tissue from previous combat wounds, and the standard surgical textbooks offered no solutions for this specific configuration of trauma. He froze, his scalpel hovering in the air, sweat pouring down his forehead beneath his surgical mask. He looked across the table at Clara, expecting her to panic, expecting her online cover identity to finally reveal her limitations. Instead, Clara stepped into the primary surgeon's position with absolute, terrifying precision. Her hands were rock steady, moving with a speed that defied human error. She didn't use standard civilian instruments. She called for specialized, compact military tools, bypassing traditional techniques entirely. She began to perform a highly complex, blind digital dissection of the aortic arch, relying entirely on her sense of touch and her deep, experiential understanding of combat trauma. As she worked, she calmly instructed Julian on exactly where to hold the retractors, how to maintain suction, and when to apply counterpressure. She didn't scream, she didn't belittle him, and she didn't bring up his years of mockery. She simply directed him with the cold, efficient focus of a commander winning a battle. Julian found himself hanging on her every word, moving his hands precisely where she told him to, realizing that he wasn't witnessing a standard medical procedure. He was watching a masterclass in survival. For 4 agonizing hours, they fought for the patient's life. Twice, the heart monitor went flat, and twice, Clara brought the patient back from the brink of death using aggressive, highly unorthodox cardiac massage techniques that Julian had always believed were impossible. She didn't give up when the blood pressure dropped to near zero. She simply altered the chemical composition of the 4 fluids based on formulas she had developed herself in field hospitals overseas. Finally, with a definitive, perfectly placed microsuture, the tear in the aorta was sealed. The bleeding stopped. The patient's heart rate stabilized into a beautiful, steady, rhythmic bounce on the monitor screen. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the operating room. The military medics immediately began securing the patient for transport back to the armored SUVs, preparing to move him to a highly secure recovery facility. Clara stepped back from the operating table, snapping off her bloody surgical gloves and dropping them into the waste bin. She walked over to the sink and began washing her hands, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were finally washing away the intense adrenaline of the last few hours. Julian stood a few feet away, his body aching from the tension, his mind completely reeled by what he had just witnessed. He looked at his own hands, the hands he had always thought were the most important hands in the hospital, and realized how small they truly were. He slowly walked over to the sink next to her, turned on the water, and kept his eyes fixed on the ceramic basin. In a low, cracked voice that was barely audible over the sound of the running water, Julian said he was sorry. He told her he was deeply, profoundly sorry for every cruel word, every joke about her degree, and every attempt to humiliate her over the years. He admitted that he had been blind, arrogant, and entirely wrong about who she was and what she was capable of. Clara turned off the water, grabbed a sterile towel, and dried her hands. She turned to face him, her expression soft, devoid of any malice or triumphant superiority. She told him that she didn't care about his apology, because she had never taken his insults personally to begin with. She explained that when you have spent years watching young men and women draw their final breaths in the dirt, thousands of miles away from home, you stop caring about titles, prestige, and the names of fancy schools. She told him that the small online degree from Montana wasn't a joke to her. It was her escape. It was a reminder that outside of war, there was a quiet, simple life where people just wanted to help their neighbors without needing a medal or a headline to validate them. She told Julian that his degrees were impressive and his hands were undeniably talented, but his education had failed him in the most important way possible. It had taught him how to be a surgeon, but it had forgotten to teach him how to be a human being. The general walked into the scrub room, carrying a heavy, military-issue duffel bag containing Clara's uniform and operational gear. He informed her that the transport was ready and her helicopter was waiting on the helipad. Clara nodded, took the bag, and began walking toward the exit. She paused at the door, looking back at Julian one last time. She told him that she wouldn't be returning to the night shift at St. Jude's, as her sabbatical was officially over and her country needed her elsewhere. She expressed hope that the next time a young nurse with an unfamiliar degree walked into his operating room, he would look at the dedication in their eyes rather than the logo on their badge. She turned and walked down the long, sterile hallway, her heavy combat boots echoing with a steady, powerful rhythm that sounded like a drumbeat of a new beginning. The hospital eventually returned to its normal routine, but Dr. Julian Vance was never the same man again. The next morning, he walked into his office, took down his massive, gold-framed Ivy League diplomas from the wall, and placed them inside a desk drawer out of sight. He stopped demanding that residents bow to his presence, and he never again mocked a single member of the support staff. He became a protector of the underestimated, spending hours mentoring the nurses and community college graduates who worked the difficult, thankless shifts. He realized that true excellence isn't something you can buy with the expensive tuition, and it isn't something that can be stamped onto a piece of parchment. It is found in the quiet corners of the world, carried by the people who don't need the world to know their name, but who are always ready to answer when the call comes. Because at the end of the day, the grandest titles and the most prestigious credentials will never save a life. Only the depth of your character, the strength of your hands, and the humility of your soul can truly define the worth of a healer.